That was a public information film from the UK government. Newscast follows in an hour here on BBC One. Right now, understandably, lots of questions.
Welcome to Question Time. On tonight's panel, Robert Buckland, the government's Justice Secretary. Before that, Prisons Minister and Solicitor General for England and Wales. Labour's Shadow Schools Minister, at one time President of the National Union of Students, Wes Streeting. Joining us down the line, former Prime Minister of Australia between 2015 and 2018, and twice leader of the Liberal Party in Australia, Malcolm Turnbull. Anand Menon, Professor of European Politics at King's College London and Director of the research group UK in a Changing Europe. And Talkradio host and journalist Julia Hartley-Brewer. Good evening, welcome to my guests here in the studio and to Malcolm Turnbull, who is joining us down the line. Bright and early in the morning for you, Malcolm, I know, from Australia. Thank you very much. And our live audience is with us again via video link. This time you are from Chelmsford. It's very good to see you there. And thank you very much for joining in the programme, for watching us. You can join in the conversation in the usual way, as you know how, on social media at BBC Question Time. So let's hear what you've got to say about tonight's discussion. And our first question tonight is from Steve Lester.
Good evening, Fiona. Good evening, panel. I'd like to ask, so it's the final orders at the last chance saloon with regard to Brexit. The country's economy is on its knees, and regardless of whether you're being a Remainer or a Leaver, we're all suffering from a lack of closure due to the stubborn egos on all sides. Where and how is it going to all end?
Well, that is the $64,000 question. Robert.
Well, I wanted to end in a deal, and I think we're now very much at the end game. It looks like the end of the weekend when things will be decided one way or the other. We've been very clear that we're not asking for the earth. We're not even asking for a bespoke deal. We want something akin to the relationship that the EU enjoys with Canada. Very straightforward, a free trade agreement that allows a sovereign state in the form of Britain and a sovereign bloc to work together. And I very much hope and believe that a deal can be done.
Because the Prime Minister is sounding very pessimistic about it this evening.
Well, he's being very firm and direct about what we can't accept. And the idea that somehow there can be a continuing legal link of the type that was in the end rejected, not just in a referendum, but in a succession of general elections, is only stating the truth. And throughout this, we have been extremely direct about it. We've said that that is not acceptable. We can't have a future relationship that means that if we do something as a sovereign state, then Europe can impose tariffs or other penalties upon us. That doesn't seem to me to be consistent with a future free trade arrangement like ones we see across the world. And it's only right that we're straightforward about that.
What about this sort of contingency deal, if you like, that the EU has suggested today, that if we don't manage to strike a deal, and as I said, the Prime Minister is sounding very pessimistic about it this evening, that there will be contingency plans so that the planes can keep flying, so that freight can keep going between the two countries. Is the government likely to accept that deal?
Well, look, we've been preparing throughout for a change that was going to come in any event. At the end of the year, with or without a deal, there were going to be changes.
But is the government likely to accept what the EU is offering in terms of kind of a sort of easing of movement between the EU and the UK while a deal tries to get thrashed out?
Well, look, we will do everything to advance the interests of the citizens that we serve. And clearly, it's in everybody's interest to avoid the sort of logistical difficulties that
is that
might
a yes or a no?
be caused. Well, look, I'm concentrating on the current negotiation. I think it's right for us to do that and really push it to the end. And, you know, the Prime Minister is straining every sinew to get this sorted out. And that's been our position throughout. It's very clear, very straightforward. I hope that my friends in Europe are listening and that they are going to act in a way that means that we can reach that agreement. Well,
also listening is Malcolm Turnbull, former Prime Minister of Australia, of course. The Prime Minister here has said to us tonight, get ready for an Australia-style deal if we don't manage to sort out a trade deal with the EU. Should the UK be happy with that, in your opinion?
Well, it'll be pretty disappointing, I think. You'll find out where we have obviously a deal with the EU on WTO terms, and there are really some very large barriers to Australian trade with Europe, which we're seeking to address as we negotiate a free trade agreement with Europe. But Australians would not regard our trade relationship with Europe as being a satisfactory one. I mean, we do have, it's our third biggest trading partner, I guess, collectively, because it's such a big economy. But there are very big barriers to Australian exports of agricultural products in particular. You know, there's a lot of friction in the system in terms of services. So, you know, there's a lot to aim for. And, you know, when I was Prime Minister, we started formal negotiations of a European-Australia free trade agreement, but that will take some time. So, you know, be careful what you wish for. I mean, Australia's relationship with the EU is not one from a trade point of view that Britain, I think, would want, frankly.
Julia?
Well, with all due respect, Mr Turnbull referred to Brexit as a catastrophe after he left office. That's certainly not what I think it is. I mean, are we going to end up with a deal? Are we going to end up with no deal? I genuinely think anyone who thinks they know right now, including Michel Barnier and Lord Frost, the two negotiators, I think they'd be lying. We don't know. Whether this is the sort of the last, waiting for the other side to blink moment, or just the inevitable drama that you would get at the end of any sort of trade deal, going right to the 11th hour, at the last second of the 11th hour, who knows. But I think the crucial thing to remember here is why people voted for Brexit. And I'm pretty sure, as is always the case pretty much when I appear on this show, I'm the only person here who voted for Brexit. And I voted for Brexit not because of, wonder what the tariff will be on oranges or on milk or on VW cars coming into the country. I voted for Brexit because I want the people who are in charge of my country to be democratically accountable to me and everyone else here. I voted for Brexit because I believe we are a proud nation, independent state, and I don't want other people to have a say over how we run our business. Now, once you have that principle, which is the main reason why most people voted for Brexit, then the difficulties ahead of getting a Brexit deal, given what the EU are offering, become very clear and very difficult to surmount. If the EU is basically saying they want to play a game of Simon Says, which is the EU says, whatever we do, you've got to follow. Here are the rules we've got. Here are the regulations we've got. And if we change them in the future, you have to change them too, or we're going to punish you. Now, there is no nation state that would put up with that. Whether they were a tiny little Caribbean nation in the middle of the Pacific, America, China, or Britain, France wouldn't put up with being told that by the EU if they were outside the EU. So it is impossible for the Prime Minister to give in on that. It's impossible for the Prime Minister to agree that the European Court of Justice should have the final say on issues of dispute. It's impossible for us to say, yes, of course we don't have any rights over our own fishing waters. These are all really fundamental principles. And if the EU is demanding we give up on those fundamental principles, then I'm afraid a deal will not be done. And if there is a cost to that, then so be it. It's not my ideal, but if that is the case, then I would still rather stick with the principles that we are an independent nation state and we should be treated like that and not as a naughty school child that needs to be punished.
And you say, obviously, that you are the only person who voted. I would just remind you, of course, we have got the government here who campaigned to take us out of Brexit and have taken us out of the EU. So it's not as if you're entirely alone here, Julia.
Sure, I'm right in what I said.
Well, we have the government here and they have taken us out of the EU. Stephen, you've got your hand up.
The question I have is, why can the government not explain to the people of Great Britain what being out of Brexit or being out of Europe actually means, and what is the real impact of no deal? Because surely no deal might be better than a raw deal based on what Europe thinks.
Anand, do you want to talk us through the implications of no deal versus a sort of thin deal, perhaps?
Well, I mean, the first thing I'll say is I've got a degree of respect for what Julia said, because there is a political principle. If there's an economic price to be paid, I will pay it. That's absolutely fine. What frustrates me about the debate around Brexit at the moment is many people who say we can leave with no deal and it won't have consequences. That's simply not true. It has enormous consequences. Even leaving with a deal has consequences because it will affect our trade. Without a deal, it means everything from checks to tariffs, which means price rises for many foodstuffs coming from the continent. It will mean bigger tailbacks than in the event of a deal. It will have a very profound impact on how our economy works, how easy it is to trade with the European Union. Now, going back to Julia, if you say, ultimately, I want to be sovereign, and by sovereign I mean they can't tell me what to do and I'll pay the price, That's absolutely fine. But I mean, one of the things that was striking to me was when the Chancellor made his statement recently, even though the OBR documents he drew on talked about a 4% impact on the economy of Brexit with a deal, plus 2% more if we have no deal, chose not to mention Brexit at all. And I would have thought that if you were planning for something this big, and let's face it, it's got to be big, otherwise it wouldn't have been worth the hassle. If you were planning for something this big, the government would say, OK, here are the impacts, this is what's going to happen, this is how we're going to prepare, and ultimately it will be worth it. But there's no planning, there's no preparation, and that I find mystifying.
Let's hear a bit more from our audience. There's lots of hands up. Susan.
Yeah, I get confused by the deal, no deal, because from the moment we left or decided to leave, the deal on the table was the WTO terms in the absence of anything else. So that is the deal. And I think we never lost our sovereignty by being in the EU, and we were much stronger at the table formulating the single market and working with it, which seems to have had tremendous advantages for, you know, small, medium and the big corporates in our country. So I'm just about old enough to remember going into the EU, and now we've come out. And I only saw, growing up, I only ever saw advantages in my life to being in the EU.
Tony?
Thank you. So it's really nice to hear Julia's comments, actually. So for me, it's a question of sovereignty. So I'll freely admit I voted to leave, not because of what was said on the side of a bus or promises that were made by various politicians, but absolutely it's a question of sovereignty. And if that's lost through any deal that's made in the next few days, I think that will be a sad move.
Vince?
I was a Remainer, but I actually changed my mind when I saw the level of bullying from Brussels and that we do seem to be very much dominated. And I'd like to ask everybody really is whether they're of the opinion that the EU wants it to hurt Britain and they actually want to demonstrate that other countries shouldn't begin to think about this because it will really, really hurt.
David?
Yeah, a question for Malcolm in Australia. It was interesting to hear that he was talking down the deal that the Australians have. We've always been told that we can always fall back on an Australian/Canadian deal as though it's some form of second class. And I'm surprised that Malcolm actually says it is second class deal. I was expecting him to beef it up. You were Prime Minister, sir. Are you telling me you couldn't get a deal with the EU?
Wes, I'm going to come to you in a minute, but Malcolm, do please answer.
Okay. Yeah, sure. Well, the reality is the European Union has got a long history of protectionism. I mean, you would understand that. The trade deals are very hard to negotiate. You know, Britain, the minute Britain pulled out of, the minute the Brexit vote occurred, I said publicly we will do a free trade deal with the UK. Negotiations are still continuing. I hope they'll be satisfactorily resolved, but there are plenty of points in issue. The protection of British agriculture from Australian imports, obviously being a very live issue. But you know, I'm hopeful that we'll be able to get a deal done. But look, believe me, we do not have a trade deal with the European Union per se. I mean, we trade on World Trade Organization terms. And we are seeking to achieve a free trade agreement. I mean, look, and just with respect to what Julia said, you know, it's not for me to litigate Brexit. I mean, you know, you guys got to make your own decisions. The issue, however, is that it will come with an economic cost, at least in the short and medium term. And I think what Julia said is that she voted for Brexit and was prepared to pay that cost. I think what was a pity, a real pity, is that when the referendum was held, there wasn't any clear or objective or authoritative understanding of what that economic cost would be. So in a sense, the British people were being asked to give uninformed consent. But, you know, the reality is the die is cast. So I'm afraid to say, however, that we are living in a time of rising protectionism. You know, the global sentiment sort of tends to swing from free trade to protectionism. And it's been swinging back in the area of protectionism for a while. Now, there is one good thing, bit of really good news I can give you, though, which is that when Donald Trump pulled out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, I managed to keep that deal alive without America, which was quite an unlikely prospect, but we got it done with Shinzo Abe and the other countries in the TPP. Now, that trade deal, therefore, is alive and in force. And I hope the United Kingdom will join that. And I've got no doubt that the Australian government will support that. So, you know, if you do end up joining the TPP, you'll, you know, your Aussie mates will have given you a very good hand in keeping that deal alive so that it can be joined. And indeed, I hope that America rejoins it. But, you know, Biden's got a different approach to trade historically than Trump. But, you know, protectionism per se has really risen as a political sentiment in the United States and around the world. You know, it's not, you've chosen a very courageous time to leave the largest free trade zone in the world.
Wes?
Well, it sounds like listening to Malcolm, we picked the wrong former Prime Minister of Australia to advise our Board of Trade. Look, seriously, we are days away potentially from a no-deal scenario that I don't think any of us want to see. And if anyone on the EU side of the talks, by the way, thinks that this would be consequence-free for our friends and partners over the Channel on the European continent or our friends in the Republic of Ireland, they're sorely mistaken. There's a lot riding on this on both sides of the negotiations. Lots of people's jobs, people's livelihoods, the collective security of our country and our friends across the European Union. So I want to see the government get a deal, and I desperately hope, by the way, that Julia's right and some of this is choreography. I fear, listening to what the Prime Minister said, listening to what Ursula von der Leyen from the European Union side says, that that's not where we are, and that should really worry us. I'll give some practical examples, because people don't like forecasts and predictions, but just some practical examples of what that would mean. The chairman of Tesco's is currently warning us that prices will go up by 5%. I think he understands his business. The Prime Minister's spokesman says he's right. They're telling their customers, myself included, our bills are going to go up. And what about the unintended consequences? I'm Shadow Schools Minister. In recent weeks, the Department for Education has written to every head teacher in the country and said you need to look at your school food supply chains and make sure you've got long-life products in case there's any disruption from the 1st of January. Now, I consider myself someone who's followed the twists and turns of this quite closely. I would never in a million years have thought no-deal Brexit, problems with school food. So whether it's the things we've been warned about in terms of manufacturing and just-in-time supply chains and disruption to jobs and livelihoods and the debate we've frankly been having for the last 4 years, or the unintended consequences, the unpredictable. There is so much riding on our political leaders in the next few days to try and put the ideological disagreements to one side and focus on the practical outcomes for the British people and for people right across the continent. Because if no deal was a bad idea in the good times, we are now in the midst still of a global pandemic, which isn't just having a huge impact on people's lives, but ravaging people's livelihoods. So no deal is not a future we can afford, and that's why so much is riding on the next few days.
Robert, I just want to come to you before I move on to another question, in terms of what Malcolm has been saying. As I said at the beginning of the programme, the Prime Minister has said tonight, get ready, or words to this effect, get ready for an Australia-style deal. The chances of a trade deal are not looking particularly good at the moment. And Malcolm Turnbull, you heard, is lukewarm at best about how good an option that would be. Does that not give you pause for thought?
And I thought what Malcolm said about the rise of protectionism is very interesting. And he did say that, of course, the tendency within the European bloc is indeed, sadly, to, whilst it's got a single market that works for its members, it tends to put up barriers against other states, and it is difficult to negotiate free trade arrangements. I mean,
but so how optimistic should we be feeling if you've got the Prime Minister saying, let's go for an Australia-style deal, that will be fine, and we've got the ex-Prime Minister of Australia saying, actually, it's not great?
Yeah, but what the Prime Minister is adhering to is the principle of free trade. We know that history teaches us that free trade, open markets, actually is the best way to raise living standards and to lift more and more people out of poverty. That is what works, and it is, I think, important for this country at this time to stand up and stand firm in favour of that open approach. And all we're saying to our friends in Europe is, look, we want to work with you. We're in your neighbourhood. We're your friends. You know, we've been your partners for generations. We just want to change the terms of trade. It's not so difficult to make that ask. And I appeal to them, to our friends in Europe, to put aside ideology and think of the people who we all jointly serve. And then I think we can reach the agreement that would be in our common interest. As Wes says, there's a lot riding on this, and there's huge disadvantages for our European friends if they don't come to that sensible deal.
But Robert, you're right to talk about openness, but the Prime Minister's got to be open now with the public. It's not an Australia deal, it's WTO terms.
It is.
Spell that out. The government is saying, get ready for Brexit to business. Well, get ready for what? Is it going to be a deal? Is it going to be no deal? We are days away from the 1st of January.
Whose fault is that, though?
Well, look, I'm not going to say it's all on the UK government side. It takes two to tango. But these issues are not new, right? These aren't new. And the issues that are currently being laid on the table as the barriers, they are entirely predictable. They've been the centre of the debate for years.
Okay,
and the Prime Minister promised an oven-ready deal. It's clearly not.
The oven-ready deal was the withdrawal agreement.
He didn't say oven-ready withdrawal agreement.
It was in the Conservative manifesto. It was withdrawal agreement.
And we are preparing for all eventualities. Whereas it's wrong to say that somewhere we're sitting back and not doing anything. We've invested $750 billion into new border technology. We have been preparing for this by making sure that supply chains are absolutely resilient in all our public services. This is the work of a government that's been going on not just for the last few months, but for the last 18 months since Boris Johnson became Prime Minister.
I just want
to
assure
you, I've been at the committee.
Robert, hang on.
I
just want to let Malcolm Turnbull in because he can't jump in quite as easy as you can, and he's had his hand up. Malcolm.
Yeah, so thanks, Fiona. Look, can I just inject an air of perhaps objective realism here? There's an old political saying in Australia, in the great race of life, always back self-interest because you know it's trying. Now, the reality is Robert is right when he makes the point that trade benefits both sides. And so, you know, it doesn't, the Europeans have an interest in having a good trading relationship with Britain. I mean, they don't want to sort of suddenly freeze Britain out. They don't buy British goods because they particularly like the British, or it's a financial, commercial thing. However, here is the point of reality. There is always a market for protectionism politically. Politicians will always get applauded when they support or protect local industries, particularly those that are influential. Now, Julia can say, oh, the Europeans are punishing us by not giving us a good enough deal. I mean, that's just not right. I mean, they're acting in their own rational self-interest. The British government, in its negotiations on an Australian free trade agreement, and I have to say Simon Birmingham and Liz Truss, the respective trade ministers, are doing an outstanding job on working on that. But we know we are big agricultural exporters. We are very low-cost producers of agricultural products. We know that Britain's not going to suddenly say, right, no barriers to Australian imports, of beef, lamb, etc. They're not going to do that because their farmers politically, their farmers couldn't compete, and politically that's not going to be acceptable. So the question is, how much additional access do we get to the European market? So it's not a question of punishing or anything like that. What it is people pursue their own interest. And when you step out of a free trade zone where there are no barriers, suddenly people in France and Germany and elsewhere will be saying, okay, the Brits have stepped out. How does it benefit us to give our firms, our businesses, our farmers an edge over the ones in Britain? And you know what? The British government will be doing exactly the same thing with other countries. So, it's a big, big brave world out there. And, I've got huge confidence in Britain. I mean, I think you'll do brilliantly, but but you've got to be clear-eyed and recognise there will be an economic cost, and then you've got to, sail forth and do your best in a very competitive environment.
Okay, we could obviously talk about this sometime, but there are other questions I want to get in tonight. And before I go ahead to the next question, I want to mention that we are starting a new kind of audience next year, starting on the 7th of January. And that's until we can get back on the road again and have people here in the studio with us. I can't wait for that moment, but it might be some time. So we're looking for 50 people from across the whole of the UK And each week we will take our audience from that pre-selected group of 50. We're calling it the Cutie 50. So it means you might be on quite often, and you need to be free most Thursday nights, of course, and hopefully have plenty of things to say. So do get in touch, go to the Question Time website, and you can find out more about that. It's under Cutie 50, and we'd love to see you. And hopefully I will see some of you on the programme next year. So there we are. Let's take our next question now, which is from Martin Beckwith-Brown.
The COVID virus does not have legs walking around looking for victims. The growth in infections, hospitalisations and subsequent deaths is due to too many not following the guidelines correctly. Shouldn't people be taking more personal responsibility to safeguard others?
And I imagine, Martin, you're asking this question because you've got experience of this, or this is something that's particularly irritating you?
Both, actually. It's everywhere you look. I mean, I hear the reports on TV and things where, oh, it's a minority. But the trouble is, you don't have to relax too much to create the problem. You know, in Essex, we've been historically quite low. And we're starting to go through the roof. And people, you know, I was in a supermarket this morning. There was only 2 or 3 people without masks, but there were still 3 people without masks. And they were young, fit people. And we know there are people going in and out of homes. I even talked to publicans, and they say in the area there are pubs that are not following the rules, and they're upset because they're doing the right thing and losing trade.
OK, well, let's take to the panel. Wes, let's start with you. And we had the Health Secretary talking today about infections rising, particularly in areas of the South East. So should people be taking more personal responsibility, as Martin's suggesting?
Yes, and this is a really big issue for me. Lots of you will know my constituency, Ilford North, is on the London-Essex border. We've got some of the highest infection rates in London. Our part of London and Essex has rates rising, and this week hospitals in my community have seen numbers of deaths unlike that which they've seen since the first peak. So we can't be complacent about this. The fact we've got a vaccine being rolled out is of course a huge relief, not least for those of us who are desperate for many of our own family members to get the vaccine where they're older, more vulnerable. So we can't wait for that. But we've come so far, we've made so many sacrifices. Let's not throw it away at this late stage. Let's exercise some personal responsibility, take care, look out for each other, and make sure that we get through this pandemic as well as possible, because there are lots of people in this country who've had COVID, who are still suffering long COVID symptoms. And let's not forget that as we approach Christmas, over 60,000 people have died during this pandemic. And for lots of families, this is going to be a really hard Christmas when they're missing people for the first time around Christmas. So let's just keep all of that in mind. Let's do the right thing, follow the rules, look out for ourselves and for each other, knowing the vaccine is being rolled out and we can look hopefully to a brighter year in 2021.
Julia?
Yes, I think people should take more personal responsibility, but I would like that to be in place of having restrictions on people's right to use their personal judgment and common sense. The Prime Minister's constantly talked about good old British common sense and personal responsibility.
So how would that work in practice? What would
that work in practice? That would work in practice in that we would actually trust that people will actually do the right thing, because most people have actually been following the rules. He mentions that you know, a few people aren't wearing masks. We don't know the reason why those people weren't wearing masks. I see people on the London Tube every day. There are odd people not wearing masks. The vast majority are. And the vast majority of publicans, vast majority of restaurants, shops, people going into them, people going about their daily lives in their workplaces are actually doing very, very sensible things. They're doing it because they want to keep themselves, their colleagues, their family members, their friends, people who pass in the street, they want to keep them safe.
So why do you think infections are rising then?
Why infections are rising? Because we have a virus which is now endemic. And the virus, if you look at the patterns of this pandemic, in every single country in the world, whether you compare Sweden, which didn't have a formal lockdown at all and did rely on personal responsibility, or Peru, which locked down for months and months on end, not even allowing men and women out of their homes on the same day, we have seen exactly the same curve. The areas where we are seeing the virus rise in infection rates at the moment are the areas that weren't hit back in spring before we locked down. We're in winter months.
Well, it's rising in London. London was very badly hit.
It's rising in London in the boroughs that were not badly hit before the lockdown. If you look at the actual granular data, it's rising only in areas. Havering, for instance, it's not actually rising at very large levels in anywhere else that was hit much earlier in the year. The reality is that we have got a vaccine. We should be making sure we're absolutely protecting the vulnerable, those who are over 70, those who are under 70 with underlying health conditions. But in my view, we should not be having restrictions on shops opening or closing, on pubs or restaurants. There's no evidence whatsoever that any of these particular places are causing rise of infections. On the contrary, lots of evidence actually when you have a lockdown, as Wales did, and are planning to again, or when you have a lockdown as England did for 4 weeks, you actually end up increasing the problem afterwards. They don't solve anything, they don't break any circuits, they don't break any fires. All they do is delay the problem. I think we should rely on adults in this country and trust their personal judgment about keeping themselves and other people safe, and as they have been doing anyway, and allow people to go about their normal daily lives as much as possible.
Anand.
Well, yes, obviously people should take responsibility for themselves and for others. And actually there's been some really interesting survey data from YouGov that showed that the majority of people who said they would take the vaccine would take it not because the government told them so, but because they thought it would help others. So I think that community spirit exists in this country, but I disagree with Julia on the lockdown. I mean, it's interesting that last week of November, the 21st to the 27th, was the first week that the death toll fell.
That was a lag from the infections.
September.
The infection rate went down before we went into lockdown. That is official ONS data.
It's not. I don't think you're right.
The death rate went down, as it always does, with the time lag from the infection rates going down. Same for the first lockdown. The infection rate was going down before we went into lockdown.
Over the 2 weeks before the English lockdown was announced, on the 30th of October, cases rose by 29%, hospitalisations rose by 50%, deaths rose by 137%.
The data that was given out and the data that was used has since been gone through, and even at the time that was being questioned. The data that was used at that time was already weeks out of date.
Yeah, but cases were still rising.
Cases were rising at a lower rate. They weren't doing that. They were doing that.
Okay, but just so we're clear, they were rising.
The rate of increase was slowing. It was actually already levelling off and going down in some areas before we went into lockdown. That's official data.
Anna, let's let you finish your point.
We could trade statistics, but let me say, I think there are other aspects to this than people doing what is common sense. I mean, I don't understand what common sense is, but I think there's an important role for government here, and I think there are several things to be said. One, the government has to be clear and consistent in its messaging. And what the Welsh case shows me is not that lockdown doesn't work, it's just that if you lock down, then open the taps, everyone floods out again, and it just leads to more rises in infections. You need to be steady and gradual about these things. And there's a bit of a tendency at the moment to say, don't worry, at Christmas we can all go out. And that, as we've heard from Chris Whitty and Balance yesterday in Parliament, is possibly going to lead to an increase in cases in January. So we need to think carefully through what government strategy is. And the final thing is, guidelines need to be clear, and those in power need to be shown to be respecting them as well. I don't want to harp on about this, but the damage done by the Barnard Castle trip. Because the moment that people think either that lot aren't listening to the rules, or actually the rules are a bit silly, Scotch eggs in pubs, and actually once you start thinking the rules are silly, then the whole thing starts to fray at the edges. And
what if you allow government to tell you what you can and can't eat and where you can and can't eat in a free country? That gets a bit silly too.
Well, let's hear from our audience, because there's lots of hands up, and I'd like to hear from you. Chris.
Thank you. It seems to me that we've proven already that common sense doesn't work. So I think we need to take a different approach. And why not be a lot more granular about it? Rather than going county-wide or even country-wide in the case of Wales, why don't we focus on the areas where it's really happening? So in Basildon, for example, which is the case that's being cited in Essex at the moment, it's not throughout Basildon that there's the problem, it's in certain areas. So why don't we just attack those areas?
Diane?
I actually think that the government's policy on Christmas is ludicrous. We're all going to get together. Well, I'm personally not, we're not. Families are going to get together. Families are going to have a drink. Families are going to cuddle each other when they shouldn't be cuddling each other. And does Julia really think that we're not going to have a lockdown after Christmas?
I'm sure we will.
Jimmy?
Thank you. I think there's a degree of conformity fatigue with a lot of people. And the problem is that the message has been so blurred and so varied over such a long period of time that now conspiracy theories have a lot more gravity and they have a lot more attachment than they would ordinarily. I think people are looking for an opportunity to not conform any longer. People are tired of it. And that's largely because of the mixed messages and the flip-flopping that's been done, I think, from the government.
And Malcolm, Australia took a different path to the UK in a number of ways in terms of dealing with the lockdown. Where do you stand in terms of Julia's, let people take their own responsibility for it versus the role of the government?
Well, I think the government's got a huge role. Look, we're a federation, so a national federal government, 6 states and 2 territories. Much of the heavy lifting was done at the state and territory level. So a number of the a number of the states actually closed their borders. In fact, at different times, all the states closed their borders against other states. We had I think we went harder on lockdowns, and particular on the borders, the international borders, sooner than many other countries did, including the UK. And look, the reality is, this is a very complex area, and I don't want to oversimplify it, but it's obvious that this is a highly infectious disease. And so the way to stop it spreading, as the gentleman from the audience said, it doesn't have arms and legs, it's spread by people. You've got to have social distancing, you've got to wear masks. The sooner you can impose those measures, the less transmission you'll get. Australia has had a relatively good experience. We really we sympathise with the rough time the British people are going through, and we wish you all the best. We wish there was something we could do to help from this end, and I hope the vaccines are distributed as rapidly as possible. But I think what we've learned globally from this pandemic is that early action is best. The proposition that people should just be free to do whatever they like is pretty naive. Frankly, it sounds good as a political soundbite, but it doesn't work out very well in the intensive care unit.
And Malcolm, can I ask you, you say
the country that's probably done the best of all is Taiwan.
Malcolm, can I just jump in for a minute?
Very early.
You say that
Sure.
acting quickly was critical for Australia. Do you think the UK government acted too slowly?
Well, it didn't act as quickly as Australia did. It's ultimately, Fiona, every country in the world, particularly, at similar stages of development, is dealing with the same issues. Robert's dealing with the same justice issues as his Australian counterparts are, as his French counterparts are, and so forth. What's interesting about the pandemic, it's like an old-fashioned examination. Every country in the world had to face exactly the same problem at exactly the same time. It's like being in the examination hall when the invigilator says, right, it's 9 o'clock, you can start writing, you've got 3 hours. And so we can actually test in real time what approaches worked best. And I think a key thing, of course, there are cultural issues. Obviously, the more trust and confidence people have in the government, the better, the more likely they are to take guidance from the government. The point Anand made about leadership and consistency is a very powerful one. So, I think the reality is social distancing, masks, all of those old techniques that have been around for millennia, or for centuries anyway, probably millennia as well, have been the most effective.
Robert.
Well, here we are towards the end of an extraordinary year, and having been in a position of responsibility throughout this crisis, I can tell you that Malcolm's characterisation of it being one giant exam question is probably a very good one. And I think, like all other governments in the world, we have had to learn on the job.
And what mark would you give the government?
Well, look, I'm not going to start marking the government because we're not out of the woods yet. We are still in a position where this virus is very much in our community. The vaccine has started to arrive. That's great, but we cannot take our foot off the pedal. We've got to keep dealing with this problem wherever we see it.
And what about Diane's point about she thinks it's ridiculous that people are being allowed to get together at Christmas.
Well, look, I think it was right of us to recognise that Christmas is a particularly important time of the year. I think within that, a lot of people, a lot of families are making decisions. And I'm, certainly from my experience, talking to lots of families who are going to exercise restraint. And here's the thing. I think there is clearly a role for government in setting a plan. We have the COVID winter plan that didn't just involve a lockdown, it involved a return to different tiers, which I think was very important rather than just letting everything hang out after the end of the lockdown, and I think that will help make a difference. But at the same time, this isn't just about government activity, it's about each and every one of us. And government, yes, trust is a big issue, but government has to show that it trusts people as well. And that's why I think it's important that in terms of the messaging that we give out, that we don't sound ineffectively authoritarian. In other words, we don't become too shrill and we don't become too didactic, because we couldn't achieve the progress that we've done without the cooperation and the solidarity of the people of this country. All of us have played our part in dealing with this virus, and the government trusts people to do the right thing. Now, we have a regime in place to deal with those cases where people are behaving in a way that is clearly irresponsible, and we've seen a lot of fines being issued, a lot of enforcement action.
Didn't work
but I
for
do
Dominic Cummings, though,
think,
did it?
well, look, I take the point about personal responsibility, personal examples. I think that episodes like that, whether it's people who at some point have been involved in politics, no more, but celebrities and other people, it clearly has an impact on all of us. I think I think one of the contributors...
Do you think he did break the guidelines?
Well, look,
of course he did.
Of course he did. Look, and it was one rule for him and another for everyone else, and that did massive damage.
It was
an absolute
deeply unfortunate episode. There is no doubt about that, and it didn't help when it came to creating a consistent message. But I think one of the contributors making this point about fatigue and about people feeling this is an awfully long road, we've got to understand that as well. And that's why the message is about the end of the tunnel, the vaccine, what we still need to do in order to deal with this problem, because social distancing will be with us for a considerable period of time. All these messages, I think, actually are well understood by the majority of the British people. I trust them to do the right thing, and I know together...
You don't trust, that's a lie. I'm sorry, you do not trust the British people to do the right thing. Otherwise, you wouldn't decide who they can or cannot go to the pub with, who they can or cannot have in their home, whether they can be on their patio or not their patio, which tier they're in. It's an absolute nonsense for this government to claim that you don't want
Julia,
to be too dramatic about what people
police in everybody's home or in everybody's pub.
We are policing people's homes.
We have not.
Right now, we are policing people's homes.
Well, we're recruiting thousands more as we speak.
You think if I had my family, if I had people from outside my immediate family from my household in my home tomorrow night, that I would still have my job the next day? I doubt it.
Julia, if we took your approach, then the NHS would be overwhelmed. One of the biggest factors in the decision-making that I was involved with...
So you don't trust the British people,
forgive me, I was involved...
So you just said you do trust the British people, but if we didn't have the rules telling people who we can and can't see and where we can...
I was involved in the decision-making, and I saw the figures about rising problems with the NHS, capacity in our hospitals. I certainly wasn't going to preside, as a minister, over a disaster in our NHS. That was absolutely out of the question. We would have failed the British people. Throughout this, we have protected our health service and made sure that it has been able to work throughout this crisis.
Let's take another question from Janine Sawyer.
Good evening. Footballers at Millwall and Colchester were booed for taking the knee in support of Black Lives Matter on Saturday. A government minister, when interviewed on Sunday, did not unequivocally condemn the fans. Should more have been said by both the politicians and the clubs in support of the players?
Well, let's just be... You're referring to George Eustace, are you, Ginny, in terms of government? Let's just be clear exactly what George Eustace did say, Robert. I just wonder if you want to clarify what the position is.
I'm sorry, I didn't catch fully what George said about that, so I can't...
I mean, George Eustace, he talked about Black Lives Matter. He put it capital B, capital L, capital M. That he certainly talked about that, Janine. I think that's what you're referring to. Anand?
I think it was wrong to boo the players. Let me start with the other side of the argument.
And do you think they were right to take the knee?
Yeah, I think players can do, if that's how they want to show their support for trying to get rid of racism in sport. Look, I get irritated when I'm watching football and the Black Lives Matters logo comes across the top. I don't like being force-fed what I should think, even if I agree with it. I don't like being told I have to wear a poppy. I don't like people telling me what I should think, OK? It irritates me. I also think that there's a lot of virtue signalling, particularly by corporates, who actually don't do very much for sort of inequality or prejudice or that in their day-to-day practices, but stick a logo on their site to make themselves feel better. There are all sorts of problems with this, but it was wrong to boo for several reasons. One, because it's just rude. I think the players who kneel are kneeling because they want to make a statement about racism. I simply do not believe that the players believe in a movement that wants to undermine capitalism. I think they're trying to show respect and to make a stand against racism. And I think booing that is unpleasant. And I think also that if a bit of hectoring by the TV companies is a pretty small price to pay for sport at long last doing something about this. I remember as a kid watching football with my dad, and you'd hear the monkey noises, and the commentators wouldn't say a word. We were sitting there going, "You're not going to say what's going on the telly," and they wouldn't say anything. TV has got, has a pretty sordid past when it comes to race and sport, and I think they're probably overcompensating and over virtue signalling now, but I'd far rather that than where we came from, and it is a step in the right direction, though only a step, because recognising racism is the first step. Dealing with it, dealing with prejudice of all kinds, dealing with prejudice against people of a different colour, different sexual orientation, of a different class. All of that exists in our society. We need to go beyond kneeling to acting.
And Robert, just to be clear, I thought you'd be across this, but what George Eustace, he was played the clip on television of what happened in Millwall. He said he couldn't hear it terribly well, but he did say that if players want to take the knee, that should be respected. In terms of the question from Janine, though, have football clubs, have politicians done enough?
No. And I think Anand's point about the sort of endemic, tolerated and accepted racism in football and other sport is sadly well documented. It's not over yet. And I think if people want to make that sort of demonstration and that gesture, then they should be respected. But I think Anand is right as well, that it's no good just putting slogans up and trying to convince people that somehow that's going to be enough. It's up to all of us in our conduct, what we do, to not just talk about the characteristics and the issues, but to go beyond that and look at the people whose lives are affected by this, because there'll be other circumstances that will accompany a lot of this that creates the barriers that have to be removed. And therefore, absolutely, booing of that is disrespectful, it's rude, it's intimidatory, it's unacceptable. But at the same time, we all need to be free to make our own contribution and do things in our own way if we are really going to combat some of the and overcome some of the barriers and the prejudices that still exist in our society. Mark.
Thank you, Fiona. Yeah, I was obviously upset about the booing. Is what I don't understand is when they are going to start booing, afterwards they're going to start cheering the same players that scored a goal for them. And coming back, I know you don't like coming back, but I was a bit discombobulated about Julia's comment about the small Caribbean islands. I just wanted to know what she was on about there.
It was a comment regarding whether you're America or China or a small Caribbean island, i.e. a small nation state without much power.
Phil.
I was just going to add, I think, although in terms of player support, last night or the night before, there was a game in Europe where actually two teams did walk off the field in process about a racist comment made by one of the officials. So I think it does go beyond just taking the knee now.
Martin?
Yeah, I mean, I still remember Martin Luther King. And so this topic has started even before then, as we know, and it's still raging on. I just don't know how we get away from this almost tribal view of other people, especially when the point that Anand made about he doesn't like to be told what to think. And I think a lot of people feel like that, whether it's right or wrong.
Steve?
I am totally against any form of racism. I think it's just intolerable. And it always has been. But I do feel that the taking the knee might be becoming past its sell-by date, should we say, in football matches, in as much that everyone's doing it. You look at F1. You look at the grid before each Grand Prix, and they have the Black Lives Matter moment there. Half the drivers don't kneel, but sort of they stand and respect the moment. And I honestly think that sort of you look at what is going on within football and other sports with racism. I think it's got to the stage now where the clubs have got to be more accountable for their fans' behaviour. I know I've been to football matches where you hear it on the tannoy, and it says to you, sort of, if you hear a racist comment, please report it to a steward. Well, you can sit in a London derby and you hear racist protests aplenty. You tell the steward, and the steward just walks away. There's got to be a much harder, firmer line on it than just sort of like taking the knee or sort of saying that sort of we won't tolerate racism. We've got to actually physically kick it out.
Julia, let me take you back to the original question. So it's talking about the footballers at Millwall and Colchester who were booed for taking the knee in support of Black Lives Matter. Was enough done by politicians and football teams?
What action should they do if people are allowed to make their gesture of taking the knee? Surely the fans are allowed their gesture back. I don't actually approve of either.
Right.
Hang on.
Are you saying that it was fair enough that the fans were booing the players?
The fans are allowed to boo. It's not something I would have done myself. That said, I don't think that the players should now or should ever have been taking the knee. I think people were desperate for football and sport genuinely to come back after the lockdown, and desperate for some escapism from the politics, from the difficulty of daily life, and they would like to have politics separate from football, and they didn't want it brought in. I think it's absurd that we should almost even need to say, of course we don't want racism, of course we abhor racism, and we don't want racism in football.
So when black players feel that it's important to take the knee, you think they shouldn't be taking the knee?
We don't allow political demonstrations of any other kind, other than the wearing of the poppy in football matches, and we do that for a very good reason. And this was a political demonstration. The players originally, when they started the Premier League matches, had Black Lives Matter written on their shirts, the slogan of a now political organisation. Now, regardless of the Marxist defund the police aims of the organisation, I think it's quite bizarre that the only demonstration that happens at the beginning of our football matches should be a demonstration in relation to the horrific racist murder of a black man in America many, many months ago. It's not something that happened in this country. It's not something that anyone in this country would endorse or say was ever acceptable. I find it strange that that is the one thing. I'm looking forward to those same footballers showing the same principles when, for instance, many of them will be playing for England in the Qatar World Cup. When they go to Qatar, will they be taking a knee for all the women who have no real legal rights and the violence that goes against them? Will they be taking a knee for all the gay people who are imprisoned or even executed for being gay? Why are we choosing this one horrific, terrible, terrible act of injustice and violence as the one issue that we are expecting to have a political demonstration of every single week? I think we can all agree it was a horrific murder. We don't want it to happen. There needs to be more to tackle police violence. There needs to be more to tackle racism in sport, and in football in particular. But I don't feel the need, and I think a lot of fans feel the same way, to have a demonstration and a gesture about it every single match.
Wes? I'll come to you in a minute, Anand, but Wes?
Sometimes things happen in history that are so shocking and so brutal that it forces a conversation and opens up an opportunity to shift the dial in a positive direction and change deep, ingrained, endemic problems which plague societies. The murder of George Floyd, on camera, in front of the eyes of not just America but the eyes of the world, opened up such a conversation. Racism isn't new in this country or the United States of America. And on a number of levels, of course, racism in this country is very different than it was in the 80s when I was born, or in the 50s and 60s. We don't have signs up any longer that say no blacks, no dogs, no Irish. But hate crime remains a problem and is on the increase in too many cases. Indirect discrimination, whether through education, employment, criminal justice, that remains a problem too. When Millwall footballers decided to take the knee, no one thinks that it was some kind of Marxist protest. No one thinks that it was about defunding the police. What it was about was saying, we're not going to be bystanders to racism, and we think this conversation is important, and we, footballers with fans and a following, are going to use our platform to say something about it and encourage you to join in. Let's not pretend that the booing of those players was anything other than a racist response to an anti-racist protest. And let's also remember...
Can I just say, just in fairness, I have to say that whether you agree with it or not, that the Millwall Supporters Club has said the booing wasn't motivated by racism. They were doing a reaction to the taking down of war memorials and the defacing of Winston Churchill statues.
Well, let's not think for a moment that before everyone booed, they all looked at each other, had a little chin wag, and decided, what the right response, what was... let's have this kind of conversation and when we'll start booing. No, come on, let's get real about this. More positively, at Liverpool, in Anfield, and in Chelsea, Stamford Bridge, people applauded their players and stood with them. And in terms of Julia's sort of point, well, what are people supposed to do if they see or hear racism? I know that tackling racism and challenging it, particularly when it's from your own side or within your own tribe or your own team or your own family, can be difficult and uncomfortable. But I bet you it's a hell of a sight less uncomfortable than being those players on the pitch being booed by their own fans, or being the black fans on the terrace having to listen to those monkey chants, or the banana skins being thrown at players, and every other manifestation of racism we see on the pitch, off the pitch, out in the country and in our communities. The problem isn't just racism, it's bystanders to racism. And I salute the players for using their platform and their opportunity to send a message to their fans and supporters. And I think most people in this country are anti-racist and will be with them too.
Malcolm Turnbull.
Well, thank you. I think what Wes summed it up very well. You've got to have zero tolerance for racism in a multicultural society, above all, as Britain is, as Australia is. You've got to treat people with respect. Mutual respect is the glue that binds our diverse societies together. Taking a knee is a perfectly respectful statement. It's a statement about racism. It's a statement of and against racism. Booing people in any context is abuse. Let's be frank. And so, we've had experience here in Australia with some fans booing Aboriginal players, one in particular, Adam Goods, who's a real champion for First Nations peoples here and First Australians. And look, I think you've just got to have zero tolerance for racism. I honestly can't improve on what Wes said. I think he summed it up very well.
Anand, we've not got much time, but I know you wanted to come back in.
Well, so I agree with Wes that the killing of George Floyd was a sort of a seismic moment that led to a debate that was long overdue that we had. I mean, I shared Julia's reservations to an extent about it being Black Lives Matter. I mean, I don't understand, actually, to be honest, why it isn't kick it out. But the fundamental issue for me is you have these incredibly powerful and influential role models, these footballers who are revered on, as sort of role models, basically saying at the start of every game, racism is wrong, don't do it. And however imperfect it may be, and whatever sort of connotations there might be hanging around the edges, that statement in and of itself, I think, should be welcomed.
Our hour is up.
No way.
We're gonna end it here. I have to say, you've still got some of you still got your hands up, but we're out of time, I'm afraid. Tonight, our lovely audience came from Chelmsford. Thank you so much for joining us. Our last audience before Christmas, and I just want to say, of course, don't forget wherever you live. Do apply if you'd like to join the QT50, our new UK-wide audience, and that will start in the new year. And you can do that by going to the Question Time website, and you can follow the instructions there. And who knows, I might be seeing you virtually on our big screen in the new year. I'd love that to be the case. Adrian Charles, of course, is coming up on 5 Live Question Time Extra Time with his guests, and you can see on the screen how to get in touch by phone, by text, or by tweet. You can have your say there as well. For now, I just want to say, before Christmas for us. Thank you very much to the panel for coming tonight. Malcolm, thank you for getting up early in the morning there in Australia. I should say that Malcolm earlier shared his view of the Bay, which was pretty gutting for all of us. It's been such a great day here in the UK. But Malcolm, thank you very much for joining us. And of course, our audience at Chelmsford, thank you as well. And to all of you at home, thank you very much for watching. Bye-bye.
Who's your 2020 hero? The incredible people that made anything possible. We created